On the night of December 29, 1916, a group of Russian nobles lured a man to the basement of the Moika Palace in St. Petersburg. They fed him cakes laced with cyanide. He ate them with pleasure and asked for more. They gave him wine poisoned with more cyanide. He drank 3 glasses and seemed completely unaffected. Frustrated, one of the conspirators shot him in the chest at point-blank range. The man collapsed. They left him for dead and went upstairs to celebrate. But when they returned to dispose of the body, the man was gone. He'd gotten up and was trying to escape through the courtyard. They shot him again, and beat him viciously with clubs. Finally, they wrapped his body and threw it through a hole in the frozen Neva River. 3 days later, when they pulled the body from the water, they found scratches on the ice from the inside. The man had still been alive when he went into the freezing water. He'd tried to claw his way out before finally drowning. Or so the legend goes. The truth about the death of Grigory Rasputin, the man they called the Mad Monk, has been debated for over a century. What we know for certain is this: a peasant mystic from Siberia gained such incredible power over the Russian royal family that nobles felt they had to murder him to save the empire. And when they killed him, the story of his death became so outrageous, so impossible, that people are still arguing about what really happened. This is the story of Rasputin. Holy man or charlatan? Healer or fraud? The man who held the fate of an empire in his hands. The man who wouldn't die. Grigory Yefimovich Rasputin was born in 1869 in Pokrovskoye, a small village in Siberia on the Tura River. His family were peasants, poor farmers scraping out a living in one of the harshest regions on earth. Rasputin was the only one of his 7 siblings to survive childhood. Disease, starvation, and the brutal Siberian winters killed the rest. Young Rasputin showed no particular inclination toward religion. He was known as a troublemaker, a drinker, a thief. There were rumors he'd stolen horses, which in rural Siberia was a serious crime. At 17, he married a local girl named Praskovia Dubrovina. They had 3 children who survived infancy. By all accounts, Rasputin seemed destined for a life of anonymous poverty in the Siberian wilderness. Then, at age 18 or perhaps in his early 20s, accounts vary, Rasputin experienced what he called a religious awakening. Some say he saw a vision of the Virgin Mary. Others claim he simply decided to dedicate himself to God. Whatever the reason, Rasputin abandoned his family and set out on a religious pilgrimage. He walked for thousands of miles. He visited monasteries. He spent time with hermits and holy men. He traveled to Mount Athos in Greece, the center of Eastern Orthodox monasticism. 4 years, he wandered, praying, fasting, learning the ways of religious mystics. When he finally returned to Pokrovskoye, he was changed. He wore the rough robes of a wandering holy man. He let his hair and beard grow long and wild. He spoke of visions and prophecies. And people said he could heal the sick. Rasputin never became a priest. He never took holy orders. He wasn't ordained by the Russian Orthodox Church. He was a starets, a self-proclaimed holy man, a spiritual advisor who claimed to have a direct connection to God. And in early 1900s Russia, Starzi were common and often respected, even if they operated outside the official church hierarchy. Word of Rasputin's supposed healing powers spread. People came to him with ailments. He'd pray over them, lay his hands on them, stare into their eyes with his piercing blue gaze. Some claimed to be cured. Others said he was a fraud. But enough people believed in him that his reputation grew beyond his small village. In 1903, Rasputin traveled to St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire. He was 34 years old, a crude Siberian peasant entering one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. He should have been laughed out of town. Instead, he charmed his way into the parlors of the aristocracy. Russian high society in the early 1900s had a fascination with mysticism and the occult. Wealthy nobles hosted salons where they discussed spirituality, attended seances, and sought guidance from mystics and fortune-tellers. Rasputin, with his wild appearance and claims of divine connection, was exactly the kind of exotic figure they found fascinating. He was introduced to members of the extended Romanov family, relatives of Tsar Nicholas II. They were impressed by him, or intrigued, or perhaps just entertained by this strange Siberian who spoke in religious parables and claimed to see the future. Whatever the reason, They arranged for Rasputin to meet the Tsar and Tsarina. On November 1, 1905, Grigory Rasputin was brought to the Alexander Palace to meet Nicholas II, Emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, and his wife Alexandra. It was a meeting that would change Russian history. Nicholas and Alexandra had a problem that consumed their lives. Their only son, Alexei, the heir to the Russian throne, suffered from hemophilia. The disease was a genetic disorder passed down through European royal families. Queen Victoria of England had been a carrier, and through marriages, the gene spread across royal houses. Alexei had inherited it from his mother. Hemophilia meant Alexei's blood wouldn't clot properly. Any injury, even a small bump or bruise, could cause internal bleeding that wouldn't stop. The boy lived under constant supervision. He couldn't play rough games. He couldn't run or jump without risking injury. And when he did get hurt, which happened regularly despite all precautions, the pain was excruciating and potentially fatal. The Russian people didn't know about Alexei's condition. It was a state secret. If the public learned that the heir to the throne was a sick, fragile boy who might die at any moment, it would undermine confidence in the dynasty. So Nicholas and Alexandra suffered in silence, watching their son endure agonizing pain while doctors admitted they were helpless. Into this desperate situation came Rasputin. Within months of meeting the royal family, Rasputin was called to the palace during one of Alexei's bleeding episodes. The boy was in terrible pain, crying, his leg swollen from internal bleeding. The doctors said there was nothing they could do. They expected him to die. Rasputin entered the room. He knelt beside Alexei's bed. He prayed. He placed his hands on the boy. He stared into the child's eyes with that intense gaze. And he spoke calmly, reassuringly, telling the boy he would be fine. Then Rasputin left. And incredibly, miraculously, Alexei's condition improved. The bleeding stopped. The swelling went down. The boy recovered. It happened again. And again. Every time Alexei had a serious bleeding episode and Rasputin was called, the boy improved. Sometimes dramatically. Historians still debate how this was possible. Some suggest Rasputin's calming presence helped Alexandra relax, and her relaxation transferred to Alexei, reducing his stress and somehow helping his condition. Others point out that Rasputin often told the doctors to stop treating Alexei, to leave him alone. At the time, doctors commonly prescribed aspirin, which thins the blood. Stopping the aspirin might have actually helped Alexei's hemophilia. But to Alexandra, the explanation was simple. Rasputin was a holy man sent by God to save her son. He had powers that doctors couldn't match. He was keeping Alexei alive. And she would trust him with anything. From 1905 onward, Rasputin's influence over the royal family grew steadily. He became a regular visitor to the palace. The Tsarina consulted him on matters large and small. Nicholas, more skeptical but devoted to his wife, tolerated Rasputin's presence and occasionally sought his advice. Rasputin had gone from Siberian peasant to one of the most powerful men in Russia. And the Russian people hated him for it. Rasputin's rise coincided with a period of massive unrest in Russia. The country had suffered a humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. There had been a failed revolution the same year, brutally suppressed but leaving deep wounds. The economy was struggling. The gap between rich and poor was enormous. People were angry, hungry, desperate for change. And now there were rumors that a dirty, drunken peasant was secretly running the country. That he had the Tsarina under some kind of spell. That he was a fraud, a charlatan, a dangerous influence. The Russian Orthodox Church officially condemned Rasputin. Newspapers published scandalous stories about him. Political enemies spread rumors that he was sleeping with the Tsarina, with her daughters, that he was a German spy, that he was plotting to destroy Russia from within. Most of these stories were lies. Or at least wild exaggerations. But Rasputin didn't help his own reputation. He drank heavily. He frequented brothels and bathhouses. He made inappropriate advances toward women. He was crude, vulgar, unconcerned with social niceties. At elegant dinners, he'd eat with his hands, wipe his mouth on his sleeve, belch loudly. He seemed to delight in shocking the aristocracy. There's a famous incident from 1915 at a restaurant called the Yar. Rasputin allegedly got drunk, started bragging loudly about his influence over the Tsarina, made lewd gestures, and exposed himself to other patrons. The story spread across Russia, becoming one more piece of evidence that this man was unfit to have any influence over the royal family. Historians later found that the incident was probably exaggerated or entirely fabricated by Rasputin's enemies. Police reports from that night and testimony from restaurant staff don't match the sensational newspaper accounts. But it didn't matter. People believed the story. They wanted to believe it. Rasputin had become a symbol of everything wrong with the Russian Empire. Then came World War I. In August 1914, Russia entered the war against Germany and Austria-Hungary. Initial patriotic enthusiasm quickly faded as Russian armies suffered devastating defeats. Casualties mounted into the millions. The economy collapsed under the strain. Food shortages hit cities. And in August 1915, Nicholas made a fateful decision. He left St. Petersburg to take personal command of the Russian armies at the front. This meant Alexandra was left in charge of the government. And Alexandra relied heavily on Rasputin for advice. Ministers were appointed or dismissed based on Rasputin's recommendations. Government policies were influenced by his opinions. Russia was effectively being run by a peasant mystic who had no political experience, no education, no qualification except his ability to stop a boy's bleeding. The situation was catastrophic. Ministers who tried to oppose Rasputin found themselves fired. Competent officials were replaced by Rasputin's friends and supporters. The government became a revolving door of incompetence. Meanwhile, the war was going badly, soldiers were dying by the hundreds of thousands, and at-home people were starving. Rasputin, for his part, had consistently opposed Russia entering the war. He believed it would be a disaster. He was right. But his anti-war stance made him seem unpatriotic, possibly even a traitor working for Germany. The rumors intensified. People whispered that Rasputin and Alexandra, who was German-born, were secretly plotting with the enemy. There was no evidence for this. It was paranoid nonsense. But millions of Russians believed it. By late 1916, the situation was desperate. The Russian Empire was crumbling. Revolution was in the air. And many people, including members of the royal family and high-ranking nobles, believed that Rasputin was the cause. If they could just remove him, perhaps the Tsar would listen to reason. Perhaps the government could be reformed. Perhaps Russia could be saved. A group of conspirators came together. The ringleader was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the richest men in Russia, married to Nicholas II's niece. He was joined by Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, the Tsar's cousin, Vladimir Purishkevich, a member of the Duma, Russia's parliament, and a few others. They hatched a plan to murder Rasputin. On the night of December 29, 1916, Yusupov invited Rasputin to his palace, the Moika Palace, under the pretense of meeting Yusupov's wife. Rasputin arrived around midnight. He was led to a basement room that had been decorated to look like a dining room. Yusupov offered him tea, cakes, and wine. According to Yusupov's later account, the cakes and wine had been laced with massive amounts of cyanide, enough to kill several men. Rasputin ate and drank enthusiastically. The conspirators waited for him to collapse. He didn't. He showed no symptoms of poisoning at all. He asked for more wine. He started complaining that the Madeira tasted strange but kept drinking anyway. Hours passed. Rasputin was still alive, still conscious, now drunk but otherwise unaffected. The conspirators were panicking. The poison wasn't working. Yusupov, desperate, went upstairs and retrieved a revolver. He returned to the basement, raised the gun, and shot Rasputin in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. The conspirators examined the body. He was dead. They went upstairs to discuss how to dispose of the corpse. But then one of them decided to check on the body one more time. When he leaned over Rasputin, the mystic's eyes suddenly opened. Rasputin grabbed the man's throat and tried to strangle him. Then he got to his feet and staggered toward the stairs. Purishkevich ran after him, firing his revolver. He shot Rasputin in the back. Rasputin kept going, making it to the courtyard. Purishkevich shot him again. Rasputin finally fell. The conspirators beat him with clubs to make sure he was dead. Then they wrapped his body in a cloth, drove to the Neva River, made a hole in the ice, and pushed the body through. 3 days later, police found Rasputin's body downstream. The autopsy showed he had 3 bullet wounds. One in the chest, one in the back, one in the forehead, fired at close range. Any one of these wounds would have been fatal. There was no water in his lungs, meaning he was already dead when he went into the river. And crucially, there was no trace of poison in his system. So what really happened? The story Yusupov told in his memoirs, published years later, was almost certainly exaggerated. The cyanide, if it existed at all, probably wasn't in the cakes and wine. Some historians suggest the conspirator's doctor, who was supposed to prepare the poison, didn't actually use real cyanide. He may have used a harmless substitute because he didn't want to violate the Hippocratic Oath. Or perhaps he was afraid the poison would be detected in an autopsy. The idea that Rasputin survived multiple gunshots and tried to escape is more credible. People can survive being shot in the chest, at least temporarily. Adrenaline and shock can keep someone moving even with fatal wounds. The story of Rasputin clawing at the ice from underneath is almost certainly fiction, added to the legend later. But the truth is dramatic enough. Russian nobles murdered a peasant mystic in the basement of a palace because they believed he was destroying their empire. They shot him 3 times, beat him, and threw him in a river. And when the body was discovered, it sparked exactly the kind of scandal they'd hoped to avoid. The murder was supposed to be secret. It wasn't. Within days, everyone in St. Petersburg knew Rasputin was dead and who had killed him. Nicholas was furious. These men had murdered his wife's most trusted advisor. But he couldn't prosecute them. Yusupov and Dmitri were members of the royal family. Putting them on trial would reveal the depths of the dysfunction and division within the Romanovs. Instead, Nicholas exiled Yusupov to one of his estates and sent Dmitri to the Persian front. It was a slap on the wrist. And the public saw it as proof that the Tsar was weak, that the nobility could do whatever they wanted without consequences. Rasputin was buried in the grounds of the Alexander Palace. Alexandra and her daughters attended the funeral. They mourned him genuinely. Whatever Rasputin had been, whatever he'd done, to Alexandra he was the man who'd kept her son alive. She never stopped believing in him. Just 77 days after Rasputin's death, revolution broke out in Russia. In March 1917, facing massive strikes and military mutiny, Nicholas abdicated the throne. 300 years of Romanov rule ended. Nicholas and Alexandra and their 5 children were arrested. In July 1918, Bolsheviks executed the entire family in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Alexei, the boy Rasputin had kept alive, died at age 13 from gunshots, not hemophilia. Did Rasputin's murder cause the revolution? No. The revolution was coming anyway. Russia was falling apart. The war, the economy, the incompetent government, the growing anger of the working class, all of it made revolution inevitable. But Rasputin became a symbol. To the people, he represented the corruption and decadence of the old regime. To the Bolsheviks, his murder proved that the nobility was desperate and divided. The removal of Rasputin didn't save the empire. It might have hastened its collapse. After the revolution, Bolsheviks dug up Rasputin's body and burned it. They wanted to destroy any possibility of his grave becoming a shrine. The man who'd been so hard to kill was finally reduced to ashes. Rasputin's legend only grew after his death. Books were written. Films were made. He became a figure of fascination, portrayed as everything from a holy saint to an evil monster. The stories about his death, especially the poisoning and the multiple gunshots and the river, became accepted as fact even though most of it was exaggeration. In 2016, on the centenary of his death, historians published new research. They'd examined the autopsy reports carefully. The conclusion was clear. Rasputin died from gunshot wounds, specifically the one to his forehead. There was no poison. He didn't drown. He was shot, beaten, and thrown in a river while already dead. The legend was more dramatic than reality, but reality was dramatic enough. Who was Grigory Rasputin really? That question has been debated for over a century. To Alexandra, he was a holy man who saved her son. To Nicholas, he was a trusted advisor, though Nicholas was always more ambivalent. To the Russian people, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the empire. To historians, he remains one of the most controversial figures of the early 20th century. Some defend him. Historian Douglas Smith wrote extensively about Rasputin, arguing that much of his scandalous reputation was based on lies spread by his enemies. That he was a genuinely religious man who believed in his healing powers and tried to use his influence for good. That he opposed the war and wanted peace. That he was scapegoated for problems that weren't his fault. Others condemn him. They point to his behavior, his drinking, his exploitation of women, his crude manners, his questionable advice to the royal family. They argue that even if he wasn't quite as bad as the legends claim, he was still a negative influence who contributed to the empire's collapse. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Rasputin was a complex, contradictory figure. A peasant who rose to extraordinary power. A religious mystic who also drank and caroused. A man who genuinely believed he could heal the sick but also enjoyed manipulating others. A person with deeply held religious convictions who nevertheless sinned constantly and seemed unbothered by the contradiction. He was also a product of his time and place. Russia in the early 1900s was a society in crisis. The old order was dying. Modernity was crashing into tradition. The gap between rich and poor, between educated and uneducated, between rulers and ruled, was enormous. In that environment, a figure like Rasputin could rise from nothing to incredible power simply by being in the right place at the right time with the right skills. His ability to help Alexei, whatever the mechanism, gave him access to the most powerful people in Russia. His charisma and conviction convinced them he was worth listening to. And his lack of education and social graces, ironically, made him seem more genuine to a Tsarina who distrusted the sophisticated aristocrats around her. Rasputin's story is ultimately a Russian story. It couldn't have happened anywhere else. Only in Russia, with its unique combination of autocracy, mysticism, social turmoil, and impending revolution, could a Siberian peasant become one of the most powerful and hated men in the empire. The legend of the mad monk who wouldn't die persists. The man who survived poison, bullets, and drowning. Except he didn't survive any of those things. He died from 3 gunshots on a December night in 1916, killed by nobles who thought they were saving Russia. They weren't. They couldn't. Russia was past saving. But Rasputin, even in death, became immortal. Not through resurrection but through myth. The stories, the legends, the wild tales of his life and death, they've kept Rasputin alive in popular imagination for over a century. The mad monk who wouldn't die did die. But his legend never will.